After having studied the behavior of consumers and the resulting demand curves, we are now going to look at the behavior of firms. So firms supply goods. Just like consumers seek to maximize their utility by their consumption, firms, on the other hand, seek to maximize profits. So the firm objective is actually a dollar amount. They seek to maximize the dollar profit which they have. That is the assumption that we follow in microeconomics. And therefore, they are going to choose output to the point where their profits are maximized. So this is how we approach the behavior of firms. So firms have revenues and costs, and the difference determines their profits. So we start by first looking at costs. Now costs can be divided into two kinds: variable costs and fixed costs. Now variable costs are costs that are proportional to the amount produced. For example, raw material could be a variable cost. An auto manufacturer may consume an amount of steel that is proportional to the number of units produced, so that would be a variable cost. Or if you, let's say, have a shop, then the cost of the goods that you sell would be a variable cost. If you sell twice as much, you would have to pay the manufacturers also twice as much, assuming that you do not get volume discounts. So that would be a variable cost. On the other hand, fixed costs are costs that do not change as the amount produced changes. So they do not change. For example, for an auto manufacturer, the investment made in a plant can be a fixed cost. So the auto manufacturer sets up a plant, and then the cost of setting up the plant does not vary with the number of units produced by the plant. The plant is still there. Of course, in the longer run, if the firm can vary the number of plants depending on how much is being produced, then even the cost of a plant would become a variable cost. Going back to the example of a shop which I just gave, the fixed cost in a shop would be the rent. So you may sell double the amount, but that should not increase your rent. So your rent is a fixed cost if you have a shop. We are now going to plot a cost schedule. So we are looking at the average cost schedule. Average cost is simply the total cost divided by the number of units produced. So when you plot it, it starts out by falling and then it increases. So this is a typical shape for the average cost schedule for a firm. So why do we expect the average cost schedule to be falling initially? Well, think of it this way. The firm has some fixed costs. And as the number of units produced increases, those fixed costs don't increase. So you would expect that initially, total cost would not increase proportionately to the number of units being produced. So average cost would be falling. However, later on, as the production increases after a certain point, we find that the average cost starts rising. And that could be due to the law of diminishing returns. To understand the law of diminishing returns, we first start with marginal product. So what is marginal product? Well, marginal product of an input X is defined as the additional amount of output that it produces. So the additional output Y produced for one more unit of X. So let's say you have land and you are putting in a certain amount of man hours into it for cultivation. The marginal product of a man hour would be the extra amount of crop produced for one more man hour. And the law of diminishing returns says that as we combine additional units of X to a constant amount of other inputs, after a point, the marginal product starts falling. So as you put more and more labor into the land, after a certain point, the marginal product of the additional unit of labor will start falling. It's not like the total product will fall, but the extra amount of product produced will fall. So why does the law of diminishing returns say that the average cost curve should start rising? Well, one way you can think of it is that maybe management is a fixed input. So each firm has a fixed amount of management available to it. And as the firm increases in capacity, there are other inputs which are being added, whereas there is only still one CEO and one CFO, etc. So after a certain point, as the firm's output grows, it's the marginal product by the output, the increasing amounts of output starts falling. So the average cost starts rising. After the average cost schedule, we are going to look at the marginal cost schedule. So the total cost is found by multiplying the number of units produced by the average cost. So this gives total cost. So what is marginal cost? Well, marginal cost is increase in total cost for one more unit being produced. So it is the increase in total cost when production is increased by one unit. Why are we going to look at marginal cost? Because just like for consumers, we have marginal analysis. For firms also, we can do marginal analysis. Because for firms, profit is the objective function. You are going to subtract costs from revenues. So the point of maximum profit will have this, the derivative of this, to be 0. So we need the derivative of cost with respect to quantity produced, and we need the derivative of revenues with respect to quantity produced. So the derivative of cost with respect to quantity produced is simply the marginal cost. So here we have the marginal cost schedule and the average cost schedule plotted on the same graph. What you'll note first is that just like the average cost, the marginal cost initially declines, reaches a minimum and then rises. Also note that the marginal cost schedule cuts the average cost schedule at the bottom of the average cost schedule. Now, why is that so? So, the bottom of the average cost schedule is the point where average cost after falling becomes stationary for a moment and then starts rising. So why is it that at that point the average cost is the same as marginal cost? Well, think about it this way. Let's say you have Shaquille O'Neal's scoring average to be 20 points a game over 50 games. Now for the 51st game, suppose he scores 25. What do you think happens to his average scoring? It will rise above 20. On the other hand, if he scored below 20, let's say he scored 10, then his average over the 51 games would fall below 20. So for the first 50 games, the average was 20. Then depending on what happens at the marginal game, which is the 51st game, the average is going to rise or fall. When does the average remain the same? Well, the average remains the same when at the 51st game he scores 20. So when the average equals the marginal, then the average does not change. So here we are in a situation where the average is declining, and then at this point it remains steady for a moment and then it increases again. So at this point, when it remains steady, it is neither increasing nor decreasing. It must mean that the marginal unit had the same cost as the average cost. In the long run, many of the costs that were fixed in the short run can become variable. For example, a firm may be able to increase or decrease the number of plants it operates, or it can change the amount of square feet of office space it rents. It may be renting office space by the year, so for time period shorter than a year, the amount of office space that it has to pay for is fixed. However, over many years, the amount of office space it rents is variable. In the long run, if the firm experiences falling average costs, then it is said to have economies of scale. On the other hand, if it experiences rising average costs, then it's said to have diseconomies of scale. Now, different determinants of costs include prices of inputs, taxes, technological advancement, bargaining power, etc.